And that moves us into Justin Trudeau's speech at the UN that happened recently. It was actually just the other day. I'm filming this over the course of both the 23rd and the 24th of September, or I should say I'm recording this. So Trudeau's speech happened, I believe, on the 22nd or the 21st, if I remember correctly. And his speech was very, very different to Donald Trump's. You see, Trump focused a lot on foreign policy, but more specifically the problem areas. Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran. Trudeau took a complete 180 on his approach, and he focused completely on Canada. I feel like the perfect UN speech would be a combination of Trump and Trudeau, as in you talk a little bit about your nation, you talk a little bit about foreign policy, considering it's the United Nations, you know? You're kind of updating them on how you're doing and also where the problems in the world that your country sees. But Trudeau, if you ask me, it seemed to me that it was a one big virtue signal. Now, that being said, he did bring up a couple good points that I wanted to highlight and things that I agreed with, but the problem I did have with it is, number one, it was very repetitive. He only touched on a few different subjects, and he kind of touched on them repeatedly, and these are sort of the classic progressive problems: gender equality, Indigenous people. In fact, Indigenous affairs was one of his pretty much his main topic. So I ended up listening to the full half an hour speech given by Trudeau, and I was taking my notes as I was listening to it, and pretty much I got a list as we go down of the things he covered. He began by talking about Indigenous affairs and colonialism. Brought up equity and the inequities of the country and the world. He began talking about dignity and respect as a birthright and diversity as a strength. He returned then to speak about Indigenous abuse, such as their history and everything that happened under the residential schools. He moves on to talk about their conditions, how not a lot of Indigenous people have access to water, how they have a high suicide rate, and a lot of children tend to run away. He returns to residential schools, going more directly into it, talking about how it's separating children from their parents, it punishes them for practicing their own culture. Begins talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I've talked about before in the podcast, and that was a commission of people that put together all the human rights violation that Indigenous people in Canada have suffered over the years under the Canadian government. And don't get me wrong, it was a long list. They even said that they believe that at least 6,000 children died in residential schools, but that number could be bigger because records were not kept well in those schools, and many records were destroyed after the schools would close. So to get all the facts is very difficult as to what happened in there. So he was talking about I believe it was 92 or 93 policies that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission brought up is what needed to be changed in order to improve relations between the Canadian government and Indigenous people. Moves on to talk about gender problems, but talking about empowering women and young girls. Talks about poverty in Canada and what they are doing to improve it, including child poverty. He returns to talking about how his government is trying to dismantle the Indigenous affairs. He talked a little bit about climate change, went more into specifics about his tax plan and his plan, which is the improved child benefit payment, and what it's going to do for the Canadian people. Talked about economic trade, such as the Canadian-European Trade Act. Laid out how nations should be concerned in their trade agreements with workers' rights, protecting the environment, and also that the benefits of trade should go to a broad audience. And he ended up finishing it off by talking about Indigenous affairs again. Okay. I don't even know how many times in this half an hour speech Justin Trudeau said the words Indigenous.
Indigenous peoples. For First Nations, Métis Nation and Inuit peoples, Indigenous peoples in Canada, Indigenous parents, young Indigenous people in Canada, Indigenous youth, Indigenous women.
I was trying to keep track, and I think I lost track something around 15, 16 before, like, I don't even know if it was halfway through his speech. So to me, it seemed like a very big virtue signal, though. So that was Justin Trudeau's speech to the UN, and they actually ended up making a little bit of waves the day or two before, because there was a leadership meeting for members of the UN. And in this meeting, a picture goes viral of Justin Trudeau, who is wearing Chewbacca socks. Yes, Chewbacca from Star Wars. Apparently he was wearing a pair of socks with his business suit. And this sent Google searches off the scale. I think they said they had over 150,000 searches for Chewbacca socks. What I thought was a little bit interesting was what Vanity Fair had to say on this, because they did a bit which said an in-depth reading of Justin Trudeau's Chewbacca socks. And essentially they ended up saying that, quote, namely, this guy knows how to talk about him, and this is one way of controlling the conversation, end quote. Sometimes I wonder if that's true, because there was a clip that came out a few months ago at another world meeting. I think it was maybe it was the G20, I believe, or G7. And Justin Trudeau was just standing around with nobody to talk to, like a young kid in a new class. It's kind of what it looked like. He was just looking around, not sure who to talk to, what to do. So it's quite possible that this is what he was doing, but I don't know. It still seems like Vanity Fair's going a little over the top by saying this was a whole strategy. If you ask me, I don't know. It seems like it was more to do, if anything, I think it had more to do with PR than anything. Make him a little quirky. So one thing that has been getting thrown, though, in Justin Trudeau's face is that this was, in fact, well, I stated that I thought it was a virtue signal, this. I'm apparently not alone, because many people seem to believe this was Justin Trudeau pandering to try and get a seat back on the United Nations Security Council, which will be a possibility in 2021. See, back in 2010, Canada lost its seat on the Security Council underneath the Harper government. And from what I could tell, they said, I think it was because they were taking a very pro-Israel stance. At least that's what the article I found seemed to suggest. But anyway, yeah, so we lost our status back in 2010. And this would allow us to get at least a temporary 2-year seat if we were to get voted in 2021. But one reason I think this is mostly what is happening in Trudeau's speech is him pandering to try and get a seat back on the Security Council is because Justin Trudeau used this to slam Stephen Harper back in the 2015 election run. He made reference to how under Harper's government we lost our seat on the Security Council, and that was a huge loss to the Canadian image, and how we had to do everything in order to get it back. So I think this is Justin Trudeau just trying to do exactly what he said he was going to do. He wants to get our seat back on the Security Council. And what better way to pretty much sit there and shame yourself for the next half hour in your country? Don't get me wrong, there were some good things that Justin Trudeau said, and he had some good points. I mean, talking about Indigenous people, it's very true that many of them live without clean water. It's very true that the women are murdered, and there's so many unsolved cases of children's committing suicide. So these are real problems that got to be addressed. But the problem is that Justin Trudeau has done nothing so far to get into to try and improve relations between Indigenous affairs, at least in my opinion. At least in my opinion, because when he ran, he said that he was going to take in all 92 or 93 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's key points in order to rectify the government and Indigenous relationship. He's done very little for them. In fact, I did an episode a while ago where I was talking about this, that so far, over the last 2 years, he's done nothing. And recently, this was during when Justin Trudeau did a cabinet shuffle, when he spoke in his speech about how he is dismantling the Indian Act, dismantling Indigenous affairs, because he sees it as a terrible, terrible system. But to me, it seems like he's only started this after about the 2-year mark, and it seems like he's trying to campaign a little bit more. One thing that might actually be playing a factor, I don't know, but I assume, is that the Ontario Liberals are going to the polls eventually. I think in June of 2018. So I think this might also try and help him try and pander and get the Ontario Liberals back in under Kathleen Wynne. This is all just my opinion right now. This is what I think when I look at this and what he's trying to do by dismantling Indigenous affairs and try and repair it, is the fact that he's done nothing he's taken nothing from the Truth and Reconciliation and put it into practice. He's done nothing to try and rectify the situation. He hasn't tried to put fresh water into them or try and get more emergency services to try and help with the suicide rate or the murder rate or any of that. So now he comes out to the UN and he panders about how the Canadian government has failed the Indigenous people. Well, you haven't done anything for them. While I was reading through, I found an article from the Toronto Sun, and it ended up sort of echoing my feelings a little bit on it. But I ended up saying that, start off with a quote by Justin Trudeau that says, "We can't build a better world unless we work together, respect our differences, protect the vulnerable, and stand up to the things that matter most." So this is one thing that Trudeau said in his speech to the UN, and this is actually a great quote. This is one of the quotes I loved. However, the problem is such rhetoric makes for admirable, even self-serving virtue signaling, the sort of stuff the UN loves, but it ignores the ugly and messy reality of history and falsely implied a better future can be found in disapproval of the past. Now, just remember one thing. The last residential school in Canada closed down in, I believe it was 1996 or 97. So all throughout here, from 1968 to 1979 and 1980 through 1984, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, was in office. The residential schools never stopped. This was probably not at their peak, but this was still when a lot of this shit was going on. So now Justin Trudeau is virtue signaling to the rest of us, saying how the government's done nothing. Well, it turns out his father had a big part of that government. He was in it for a long time and could have made changes, and he didn't. And he constantly praises his father. Nothing wrong with praising your father, but it's a situation like this where you're criticizing your own parents, but you won't say it openly. One needs only to look to former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, our current PM's father, for a sorry chapter on Canada's past dealing with First Nations. In 1969, Pierre Trudeau's government issued a white paper proposing to abolish previous legal agreements with Canada's Indigenous peoples, to eliminate Indian status, eradicate treaties, and otherwise assimilate this country's Indian population into the Canadian state. Pierre Trudeau's plan fostered a generation of Aboriginal activism and sparked furious backlash that prompted the senior Trudeau to angrily remark, quote, "We'll keep them in the ghetto as long as they want," end quote. The harsh reality is that the paternalistic model for dealing with the First Nations was costly, bureaucratic, and broken then, and remains the way today. Successive governments have, for the decades, done a far better job for championing good intentions than in making themselves and First Nations accountable for the billions wasted while ordinary First Nation people languish. But the buck stops with the PM. He's in power now. If he wants to help Aboriginal population, as he says he does, and as we encourage him to do, then stop talking and get on with it. Because for me, dismantling the Indigenous affairs, he just put in a couple new positions inside Indigenous affairs. He just pretty much replaced them more than anything, which he says is going to make things more efficient. But how about we actually start putting money into them? Or, like I've stated earlier, why don't we give them clean water? Why don't we give them access to emergency services instead of just sitting here virtue signaling and say, well, we'll reorganize or dismantle Indigenous affairs? We can do better than that. And the last thing I wanted to talk about when in terms of Trudeau's speech was he made some reference to equity, about wanting an equitable outcome. Equity is a red flag. It should be for everyone. Anybody who talks about equity, they give you a very rose-colored glasses example of equity, which doesn't stand up to what it is in reality. Because equity is different than equality, even if many people might not realize it. And unfortunately, even if you go to the dictionary, it'll talk about how, if you look at the definitions, it'll say equity is dealing fairly and equally with all involved, and equality is dealing fairly and equally with all concerned. So there's practically no difference in the definition in the dictionary, but there actually are very two different things. So essentially what equity is, well, let's start with equality. That's the one more people know. So equality is pretty simple. It's equal status, equality of opportunity, that sort of thing. And it ensures that everybody gets the same thing. Not everybody can go out for the same job. Everybody has access to the same benefits, whatever. But then if we come over and we talk about equity, it gives people what they need to enjoy a full life. So this is different rewards for different people, for different groups, which seems fair, but not necessarily. So if we're talking equity in certain ways, it is improved. Like, it is the preferred method. However, when we're talking usually in terms of people, you want to avoid equity as much as possible, and you want to go for equality. So while researching this, one example that people were giving for the difference between equity and equality would be, take a track runner. You got a oval track, and if you have one that is capable of running, let's say like 6-7 runners or something like that, you'll see it in the Olympics and anything else. Generally what they do is anybody on furthest to the outside will start farther ahead than anybody on the inside, and this is supposed to be, the fact that the inside track is shorter than the outside track, this is supposed to make up for, it would be unfair otherwise, because then anybody on the outside has to run further in the same amount of time as the person on the inside of the track. So this would be a place where they say, well, equity is what you prefer, because then it actually makes things more fair. Very true. But then if we try and apply equity to more people in a more modern day status, so this usually has to do with opportunity, money, this, that, and the other. Well, one example I heard one time, which I think is the best example for the problems with equity, is this. Imagine you are in school. Two students. There are two students there. We'll say, picture yourself, you are the A+ student. You worked hard, you studied, you got your A+ grade. There's another student there who got an F. Now, whatever's going on in their life could be something that needs to be dealt with, for sure. And maybe it puts them at a bit of a disadvantage, but equity would say that the A+ student must lose some of their grade in order to make up for the F student who did not come as high. And if we're looking at all the grades available in between, that would give each one an average of a C+. So that person who worked hard and got that A plus suddenly loses about half of what they just made, while the person who got an F suddenly is brought up. So the difference is equality has a shared burden among all people, while equity has different burdens. Some people share more of the burden while people share less. While this might seem fair, it's not always, because a lot of times equity doesn't take into account why people are in certain situations. Some people are in certain situations because they don't have access to the same opportunity. Sure, that's understandable. Some people are in that situation because they allow themselves to be in that situation, yet for some reason they are required to help out. They are required to not do anything and get reward for it. Because we can look at the F student in this example in two ways. The F student maybe the night before they just found out that their grandfather died, you know? So you're saying, well, come on, that's not fair. Like, the person had a lot going on. They couldn't help that. Well, of course, that's absolutely true. But what if the F student is just somebody who didn't give a fuck and didn't study? Just said, screw it, I want to play my video games, I want to go out with my friends, or whatever, and just didn't study and they got the F. So that F would be on them. But according to this equity thing, they need to get their grade bumped up to a C plus, and that student that worked very hard for that A plus has to get their mark taken away. In exchange, equality would be that everybody earns their own grade. So that would be equality. You study, you do the test, you get your own grade. And I find a lot of times in life too, you can even look at it the same sort of way what happened in a classroom. Say you're that F student that's grandfather died the night before, so you couldn't study, you were upset, you couldn't concentrate. The teacher generally will allow you leeway in order for you to make up that test or whatever. A lot of times in life this happens too. If there's something beyond your control, they can't give you all the leeway, but they'll give you some leeway. Like, a teacher can't say, okay, take all the time you need, and whenever you're ready, you'll come back and do the test. Usually they say, I understand, if you need a few days, a week, I understand, but then come back and do your test then. It's like they still got to get this done. It's a similar situation I find in life that people handle it. If you are in a dire situation, people will be willing to help you. But if you're not, then if you're not willing to help yourself, then no, why should people help you? So this is my problem with equity, is equity doesn't discriminate in this way. The people who need help and people who just haven't helped themselves get lifted up regardless, and everybody who's worked hard at the top gets taken down a notch. This is why equity should be a red flag. Because equity is not nearly as fair as it sounds. And I'm going to show you one more thing. Many people have probably seen this graphic before. It's the equality versus equity graphic. So if we look at this graphic, we've got three people standing there. We got three varying heights, each one on a box. One of the small one can't see over the fence, and the other two can. And then if we look over the other side, what they say is equity. It's got two boxes for the small one, so you can see over, and the tall guy has no box, because that way it seems most fair. There are big problems with this graphic, but it's sort of, I think we can use this as an overlook at the difference, because this is more what it's about. But what this graphic does not take into consideration is exactly what I just talked about, is that some people are in those situations because of lack of opportunity. Some people are in those situations because of their own doing. Now, another good example where maybe equity would be more preferable was an example given in this article I looked at, and they were talking about school funding. So a school that has more low-income communities and people that need more resources, to look at this equally would be that everybody gets the same funding across the board, when maybe certain schools need more funding. For instance, a school for disabled children will need more funding to help them. So this is where maybe an equitable outlook is better. But in general, when we're dealing with people, especially on a social level, you don't want to deal with equity. And for me, I would be very skeptical when someone brings up equity. If they can lay out a good argument such as this for the school funding, then sure, you might be able to convince me that in that situation it might be preferable. But on the whole, if anybody just preaches on about equity, make sure you avoid them as much as possible, because they really don't know what they're talking about. A lot of time people that preach equity don't realize that they would be the one that would be torn down a bit in order for somebody else to be brought up, and they say, well, I don't have that much, so why am I being torn down? They say, yeah, but you still have more than this guy. So these were some of my problems with Justin Trudeau, and then again, he had some things that he did pretty well. One quote he made, he was making it more in reference to the Indigenous people, but I did like the quote itself, was, maybe good enough just is not good enough. Better is always possible. And I think that's just a great quote for any time. That good enough is not just good enough. Better is always possible. That's a mindset that everybody should adapt. That better is always possible. I find he made some good quotes in this, but all in all, his speech was repetitive and just a lot of virtue signaling about Indigenous people. And while the UN did receive it very well, it was not universal across Canadians. Because, in fact, this one, the chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University in Toronto, Pam Palmater, said that she wasn't very happy with Trudeau's speech. She said Trudeau talked only of past sins, glossing over the continued shortcomings of his and other governments in meeting the challenges faced by Indigenous people. And she ended up saying, quote, he's trying to save face. He's trying to make sure he gets on the Security Council, end quote. So in the end, this is really what I think Trudeau's speech was all about. It was just about getting back on the Security Council. And that was really it. One thing Trudeau did talk about was his improved child benefits payment. He talked about this, how he was hoping that they had hopes that they could reduce child poverty by 40% in Canada. And this improved child benefit payment was put in place to replace the Canada Child Tax Benefit, as well as the Universal Child Care Benefit and income splitting. And from what I can tell, it is offering more money to families. See, it's promising that 9 out of 10 families can benefit from this. It's offering, for a family with a child under 6, it's offering them $6,400 per year, which breaks up to about $533 a month. And for parents with child between 6 to 17, they get $5,400 per year, which breaks up to $450 per month. One thing about this is they said that low-income houses will receive more, and if you look on the outline for the improved child benefit payments, it even states the higher your income is, the more and more they take off. So eventually there'll be a point where you could pretty much see everything disappear you can see everything disappear altogether, or just about, you really won't get enough to really support you or anything. So this is where I think this child benefit payment falls short, is that if you make enough, there's no point to even applying for it, for the sole fact that even if you would be allowed to it doesn't give you anything worth helping you throughout the month. So that was what's being offered by improved child benefit payment, and this contrasts to the Universal Child Care Benefit, which only offered $1,200 per year, which was $100 a month for children under 6. That was original, and then they ended up bumping it up to that was the original, and then they ended up bumping it up to $1,920 a year, which brought it up to $160 per month for children under 6, and also $720 a year, $60 a month for children between 6 and 17. And it was said about 4 million families were expected to benefit from this. The requirements to get into Trudeau's new plan, the improved child benefit payment, is pretty light. You usually just have to give your income, number of children, more or less that's it. Where it seemed like the other benefit packages that it's replacing were a lot more, they were more in depth, and it was a lot harder to actually get the benefits you were hoping for. Okay. And the last thing discussing Trudeau's speech to the UN is Trudeau, before he went there, he spoke about how one thing he wanted to talk about was the Myanmar crisis. And the crisis is that Myanmar Buddhists are currently targeting, they are the Rohingya Muslims, and they've been committing acts of genocide against them. And this has caused a lot of them to flee. So Trudeau said he wanted to talk about this, and I think it may have come up a little bit in like the leaders meeting that happened a few days before Trudeau's speech, but he completely forgot to mention this on the world stage of the UN. So to me, this kind of seems like a big no-no. I mean, maybe not. He focused completely on Canada, but he didn't mention it, so I thought that was a kind of a faux pas on his part.